The fog came up from the valley like something living, something with intent. Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Crane felt it pressing against his face as his mare picked her way along the rutted path toward the Whitmore estate, each hoofbeat muffled by the unnatural stillness that had settled over the Massachusetts countryside. October mornings in the Berkshires were typically alive with sound, the gossip of crows in the elms, the rustle of squirrels preparing for winter, the whisper of wind through dying leaves. But this morning, the 23rd of October, in the year of our Lord 1853, the world had gone silent as a held breath. Thaddeus shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking obscenely loud in the suffocating quiet. In his coat pocket, the note from Ezekiel Hobbs crinkled against his ribs, barely legible words, scrawled by a hand that had been shaking violently. Come at once, the Whitmore. God preserve us. The gate. He'd found it nailed to the door of his boarding house just before dawn, and something in those fragmentary words had sent ice water through his veins. Ezekiel Hobbs was not a man given to hysteria. The old farmer had weathered Indian raids, buried 3 wives, and once shot a rabid bear at 10 paces without so much as flinching. Whatever he'd seen at the Whitmore place had unmanned him completely. The mare whickered nervously, tossing her head. Thaddeus laid a calming hand on her neck and felt the tremor running through her muscles. Animals knew things, his mother used to say. They could sense wrongness in the world before men's duller senses caught wind of it. He should have heeded that wisdom and turned back, but duty was a chain he'd worn for too long to shed now. The fog thinned slightly as they climbed a gentle rise toward the Whitmore property. The estate sat on what locals called Gallows Hill, though that name predated any actual hangings by at least a century, a peculiarity no one had ever adequately explained. Thaddeus had visited twice before on social calls. Cornelius Whitmore had been a cordial man, a Boston merchant who'd retired to the countryside 5 years prior with dreams of gentleman farming. His wife Marguerite had been a gracious hostess, their children well-mannered and properly schooled. A respectable family, God-fearing folk. The welcome gate materialized out of the mist. Like a ship emerging from fog-bound seas, it was an elaborate affair, that gate far too grand for a simple country estate. 2 stone pillars flanked the entrance, each topped with carved finials that Thaddeus had always found vaguely unsettling, though he'd never examined them closely enough to say why. Between the pillars stretched an iron archway, wrought in an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally. The metalwork spelled out the family name in ornate script, Whitmore, but it was what hung beneath that name that stopped Thaddeus's breath in his throat and caused his mare to rear, nearly throwing him from the saddle. 7 figures dangled from the veranda overhang, suspended by ropes that descended at perfectly measured intervals. They swayed with a gentle, rhythmic motion, though not a whisper of breeze stirred the fog. Back and forth, like pendulums marking time in hell's own clock. Jesus wept, Thaddeus breathed, and even those words sounded profane in this terrible silence. He dismounted on legs that threatened to betray him, looping the mare's reins around a fence post, well away from the gate. She pulled against the restraint, eyes rolling white, but he couldn't spare attention for her terror. His own threatened to overwhelm him. He forced himself to approach, each step requiring an act of will, his hand instinctively seeking the pistol at his hip, though he knew no earthly weapon would avail him against whatever had transpired here. The 7 hung in a descending line, tallest to shortest, their arrangement so precise it suggested deliberate choreography. Thaddeus recognized Cornelius Whitmore first, the patriarch's tall frame unmistakable even in death, his graying hair stirring slightly in some imperceptible current. Beside him hung Marguerite, her once beautiful face now a mask of purple-black, tongue protruding between lips pulled back in a rictus that might have been a smile or a scream. Then came the children, arranged by age and height. Atticus, the eldest son at 17, Sophronia 15 and promised to the banker's boy in Ashford Hollow, Venetia just turned 12, and young Josiah, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. At the end of this grotesque receiving line hung Aunt Prudence, Cornelius's elderly spinster sister, her tiny frame barely 4.5 feet tall. Completing the descending sequence, they all wore nightclothes. That detail struck Thaddeus with peculiar force. Clean white nightshirts and gowns, some with embroidered hems, the kind of garments one wore to bed in comfort and propriety. No one had dressed for flight or struggle. No torn fabric, no missing shoes. Young Josiah still wore his little leather slippers. For God's sake, they had walked out here in the night, in their beg, and somehow arranged themselves with mathematical precision beneath the veranda's overhang. Thaddeus circled the tableau slowly, his marshal's training warring with the primal urge to flee. The ropes were uniform in length and thickness, professionally tied with hangman's knots that suggested someone had known precisely what they were doing. But who? Had Cornelius gone mad and murdered his entire family before taking his own life? Impossible. The logistics alone defied explanation. How does one man hang 6 other people, including a strong young man like Atticus, without signs of struggle? And if it had been murder, where was the chaos, the overturned furniture, the defensive wounds? He forced himself closer, close enough to see their faces clearly in the growing morning light. The fog was lifting now, though the oppressive silence remained. What he saw in those dead faces would haunt him until his own last breath. They were all turned toward the gate, every single one, at precisely the same angle, as if they'd died while watching for someone's arrival, or as if they were greeting visitors, welcoming them to the Whitmore estate with this obscene display of domestic hospitality, and their eyes Jesus Christ in heaven. Their eyes were open, all 14 eyes, glazed with death, yet somehow still reflecting a terrible awareness, stared directly at the iron archway and the path beyond. Thaddeus felt the weight of those gazers, felt them tracking him, even though he knew the dead could not see. But these dead seemed to see. These dead people seemed to be trying to tell him something. He noticed other details now, his marshal's mind cataloguing evidence even as his soul recoiled. No chairs or stools kicked away beneath the bodies, no ladder visible anywhere nearby. The veranda railing showed no scuff marks from climbing. How had they gotten the ropes over the beam? The overhang was a good 12 feet high, an ornate structure with carved wooden brackets and decorative molding. Ropes didn't thread themselves through rafters. Thaddeus approached young Josiah's body, the sight of the small boy nearly undoing his fragile composure. The child's face was peaceful, almost serene, lacking the tortured expression of asphyxiation. His little hands hung at his sides, not clutched at his throat as one would expect. As Thaddeus looked closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Rope burns on the wrists. Fresh rope burns, as if the boy had been bound before being hanged. But there were no ropes on his wrists now. He checked the others and found the same marks every member of the Whitmore family bore identical rope. Burns on their wrists and ankles, yet no restraints remained. A sound penetrated the silence, a distant crow cawing. Then another, then a chorus of them gathering in the trees beyond the property line. The natural world was slowly returning, as if whatever had held it at bay during the night was finally releasing its grip. With the birdsong came a smell, one Thaddeus had encountered too many times in his career, the unmistakable scent of death. Sweet and cloying, mixed with something else, something that reminded him of thunderstorms and burnt metal. He stepped back from the bodies and noticed the final, most disturbing detail of all. Carved into the wooden floorboards of the veranda, directly beneath each hanged figure, was a symbol. 7 identical symbols, each about the size of a man's palm, cut deep into the wood with something incredibly sharp. They looked ancient. These marks not English letters, not any writing system Thaddeus recognized. They reminded him of the strange carvings he'd once seen on Indian petroglyphs, but older, somehow, more fundamental, as if they represented something that predated language itself. And they were still smoking. Thin wisps of vapor rose from the carved wood, dissipating into the morning air. Thaddeus knelt and touched the edge of one symbol with a tentative finger. The wood was warm, almost hot, though no flame had touched it. The smell of burnt metal intensified, making his eyes watered up behind him. His mare screamed an awful, almost human sound of pure terror. Thaddeus spun to see her rearing against the fence post, eyes rolling, foam flecking her mouth. Then she tore free and bolted down the path, disappearing into the remnants of fog with the thunder of panicked hoofbeats. He was alone now with the 7 dead Whitmores, alone with the smoking symbols and the unnatural silence and the terrible certainty that whatever had happened here was far from over. The welcome gate loomed before him, its iron letters spelling out the family name, and as Thaddeus stared at it, he could have sworn the metal was moving, flowing, rearranging itself into patterns that hurt his eyes to follow. From somewhere inside the house, a clock began to chime, 9 slow, deliberate strokes that seemed to echo across the valley. But Thaddeus could see the grandfather clock through the parlor window, and its hands had stopped at 3:33. Whatever was counting the hours, it wasn't anything built by human hands. If you're already gripping your seat after this horrifying discovery, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with your theories. What do you think happened to the Whitmore family? Was this murder, madness, or something far more sinister? Let me know below. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because this story is only getting darker from here. Thaddeus stood paralyzed for a long moment, listening to the phantom clock chime its impossible hour. 9 strokes from a timepiece that had stopped at 3:33. The mathematical wrongness of it gnawed at him. 3 and 3 and 3. The number repeated, significant somehow in a way his conscious mind couldn't grasp but his instincts screamed about. He forced himself to breathe, to think like a lawman rather than a terrified animal. There might be survivors. There had to be survivors. The Whitmores employed a housekeeper and a groundskeeper, and surely they couldn't have but, even as the thought formed, he knew it was false hope. Whatever had visited this place had been thorough. The house loomed before him. A modest federal-style structure of whitewashed clubboard with black shutters and a steep pitched roof. Under normal circumstances it would have appeared welcoming, even charming, but now those dark windows stared at him like accusing eyes, and the black-painted door seemed less an entrance than a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. He'd have to go inside. God help him, he'd have to enter that house and see what other horrors awaited. Marshal's duty, he muttered. The words a talisman against fear. Do your duty, Thaddeus. He climbed the veranda steps, carefully avoiding the symbols carved beneath each hanging body. Up close, the Whitmores swayed gently behind him, and he could hear the creak of rope fibers stretching, the soft whisper of fabric moving against dead flesh. Don't look back. Don't look at them again. Just get inside and find a living, if any living there be. The door stood ajar, not wide open in obvious invitation, but slightly, perhaps 3 inches, enough to suggest someone had left in haste or been interrupted mid-ex. Through the gap, Thaddeus could see a slice of the entrance hall, polished floorboards, a small table with a vase of flower chrysanthemums. Their rust and gold heads still freshened the edge of a mirror in a gilt frame. Everything appeared normal, domestic, utterly at odds with a nightmare hanging just beyond the threshold. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his pistol, the hinges moving soundlessly. Someone had kept them wheeled. The entrance hole opened before him, and if he'd harbored any hope of finding chaos or evidence of struggle, it died immediately. The interior of the Whitmore house was immaculate, more than immaculate. It was perfect. A runner of Persian carpet stretched toward the main staircase, not a thread out of place. The grandfather clock that should have been chiming stood silent against the wall, its hands frozen at 3:33, its brass face reflecting the morning light streaming through the transom window. On the hall table, that vase of chrysanthemums sat centered precisely, flanked by a pair of candlesticks with unburned tapers. A woman's shawl hung from a hook by the door, folded just so. Everything spoke of order, routine, a household running smoothly until the moment it simply ... stopped. Hello? Thaddeus called, his voice sounding foreign in the stillness. This is Deputy Marshal Crane. Is anyone here? Anyone in need of assistance? Silence answered him, thick and expectant. He moved deeper into the house, checking rooms. The parlor to his left revealed a space arranged for evening entertainment chairs positioned in conversational groupings, sheet music open on the piano, a book resting spine up on a side table as if someone had just set it down intending to return. He noted the title, Paradise Lost. Of course, the bookmark sat at Bookeye where Satan addresses his fallen angels. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The dining room told a stranger story. The table was set for breakfast, 9 places arranged with mathematical precision, 7 Whitmores plus 2 servants, fine china and silver, cloth napkins folded into bishop's mitres, water glasses filled and waiting. But the food had never been served. In the kitchen beyond, Thaddeus found breakfast prepared and going cold, a platter of eggs congealed into yellow rubber, bacon strips swimming in their own fat, biscuits grown hard in their basket, a pot of porridge forming a skin on the stove. The stove itself was stone cold, suggesting the cooking had been done hours ago, probably before dawn. Someone had prepared breakfast for 9 people, had set the table, had filled the water glasses, then everyone had simply walked away and gone outside to die. Thaddeus felt his stomach churn. The normalcy was worse than blood and chaos would have been. At least violence made a kind of sense, passion, madness, rage. These were comprehensible human emotions that led to comprehensible human actions, but this careful preparation for a meal that would never be eaten, this maintenance of household routine right up to the moment of mass death, this was the behavior of people already lost to something beyond human understanding. He climbed the main staircase, each step creaking beneath his boots. The second floor held 4 bedrooms and a water closet, all doors standing open as if inviting inspection. The master bedroom showed a 4-poster bed made with military precision, not a wrinkle in the coverlet. Marguerite's dressing table held her silver-backed brush and mirror, a cameo brooch, a bottle of lavender water, everything in its place. The children's rooms were similarly undisturbed. Atticus's textbooks, stacked neatly on his desk. Sophronia's sampler hanging half-finished on its frame. The two younger children's rooms showing toys put carefully away on shelves. One had dressed for the day. The wardrobes and armor stood full of daytime clothing, suggesting the family had risen, donned their nightclothes or never removed them, and walked directly to their deaths without bothering to make themselves presentable for the world. What could compel such behavior? What force could override the fundamental human instinct for self-preservation and proper appearance? In Cornelius's study, Thaddeus found the first real clue. The room was oak-panelled and book-lined, dominated by a large desk positioned before a window overlooking the front grounds. From here, Cornelius would have had a perfect view of the welcome gate and the approach road. The desk's surface held the usual implements of a gentleman's correspondence: inkwell and pen, blotter, letter opener, wax and seal. But prominently displayed, positioned as if for easy reading, lay a leather-bound journal open to its final pages. Thaddeus approached it with the reverence one might show a dying man's last words. The handwriting was Cornelius Whitmore's. He recognized it from previous correspondence regarding property taxes, but the script deteriorated across the visible pages, beginning with neat, measured penmanship and degrading into increasingly frantic scrawl. He read the final entry, dated October 21st, 1853, 2 nights previous. They come again tonight. The third night running. Marguerite hears them now too, and young Josiah claims to have seen figures standing beneath the gate when he looked from his window at midnight. I tried to tell him it was merely shadows, tricks of moonlight, but I know better. I have seen them myself. 7 figures, always 7, standing in perfect arrangement beneath that cursed archway. They do not move, they do not speak, but they call to us nonetheless, in voices that bypass the ear entirely and speak directly to something deep within the skull. Prudence claims, it began the day we arrived 5 years ago, though she said nothing at the time for fear we'd think her mad. She says she understood immediately that the gate was wrong, that it predated the house by centuries, that it was here first, and the various structures built upon this land were merely ... accommodations. Houses built around it rather than it being added to welcome visitors. She's been keeping her own journal, she tells me now. I must find it. I must understand what we've inherited. The marks appeared on the veranda posts this morning, the same symbols I found carved into the foundation stones last week when I investigated the cellar. Marguerite tried to scrub them away, but they merely burned through her cleaning cloths and reappeared, smoking, exactly as before. The children are drawing them now in their sleep. I found Venetia's primer covered in the marks, drawn over and over in charcoal until the pages tore through. I understand now what the previous owners must have experienced. Why did the land sit empty for 5 years before we purchased it? Why was it offered at such a remarkable discount? We thought ourselves fortunate. We thought ourselves blessed by Providence. But there is no Providence here. There is only the gate. And the gate is patient, and the gate is hungry. Tonight, when they call, I think we shall answer. Not from compulsion, I want that understood should anyone find this record, but from understanding. We have learned what the gate requires. We have learned what must be done to satisfy it, to quiet it, to join the chorus of those who came before. 7 souls, always 7. The number has significance I cannot fully articulate but feel in my very marrow. The gate was never meant to welcome guests. It was meant to hold us, to keep us, to make us part of its eternal collection. We go willingly. This must be recorded. Whatever appearances suggest, whatever the town may think, we choose this. The alternative to resist, to flee is worse, far worse. We have seen what happens to those who refuse the gate's invitation. Prudence showed us her journal, showed us the accounts from 1804, from 1748, from 1691. Those who ran were found eventually, always found, dragged back across miles of forest and field, their bodies so mutilated that the entry ended midst, the pen trailing off in a long scratch across the page as if Cornelius had been interrupted or suddenly stood and walked away mid-thought. Thaddeus gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. Madness, it had to be madness. Some form of collective delusion, perhaps caused by contaminated water or grain ergot poisoning. But even as he grasped for rational explanations, he knew them for the lies they were. He'd seen those symbols smoking on the veranda. He'd felt the wrongness of the gate with his own senses. This was no natural ailment of the mind. He flipped back through the journal, finding the entries growing increasingly disturbed over the previous week. Cornelius had been a rational man, educated at Harvard, well read in philosophy and the sciences, yet his words described impossible things. whispers emanating from the iron archway at midnight, shadows that moved against the direction of light, the sensation of being watched by the house itself. On October 19th he'd written, "Marguerite insists she saw our reflections in the parlor mirror continue moving after we'd stopped. All 7 of us, plus Mehetable and Silas, froze in place while our reflections danced and swayed, like hanged men. Mehetable. Silas, the servants, Thaddeus, had forgotten about them in his shock at discovering the family. 9 places are set for breakfast. Where were the other 2 members of the household?" A sound from below made him freeze, a soft thump, like something heavy shifting. He drew his pistol and moved to the study doorway, listening intently. Another thump, then a rhythmic creaking, coming from the direction of the parlor. He descended the stairs slowly, keeping his back to the wall, pistol raised. The entrance hall appeared unchanged, morning light still streaming through the transom, chrysanthemums still perfect in their but the parlor door, which he'd left standing open, was now closed, and from behind it came that creaking sound, steady and rhythmic, like a porch swing moving in the breeze, or like a rope stretching under weight. Thaddeus reached the door and pressed his ear against the wood. The creaking continued, accompanied now by a faint jingling, like chain links moving against each other. No voices, no footsteps, just that steady, awful rhythm. He gripped the door handle, cold brass, colder than it should have been. Through the door opened in one swift motion the parlor chandelier, an elaborate affair of crystal and brass that hung from a heavy chain, swayed gently in the windless room, and from it hung 2 figures, positioned to face each other across the empty air as if engaged in earnest conversation. Mehetable, Good, and Silas Fitch, the Whitmore household servants, dangled by the neck from opposite sides of the chandelier's central ring. Like the family outside, they wore nightclothes. Mehetable in a simple cotton gown, Silas in a nightshirt and trousers. Their feet hung perhaps 3 feet above the parlor carpet, their bodies swaying in that same gentle, impossible rhythm Thaddeus had witnessed on the veranda. But these 2 were different. These 2 had not gone willingly. Their faces told the story, eyes bulging, tongues protruding, necks bent at unnatural angles. Defensive wounds marked their hands and forearms, deep scratches and bruising suggesting they'd fought against their attackers, or tried to remove the nooses once placed. Mehetable's fingernails were torn and bloody, and similar blood marked the rope around her neck where she'd clawed desperately at it. Silas's right arm hung at a wrong angle, dislocated or broken, likely from struggling against restraints. They'd been murdered, forced into position and hanged while the family, their employers, went docilely to their own deaths outside. But who had done the forcing, and how had they gotten 2 adult bodies suspended from a chandelier that hung a good 8 feet above the floor? Thaddeus scanned the room for evidence of a ladder or furniture used for climbing. Nothing. The chairs remained in their conversational groupings, undisturbed. No scuff marks marred the polished floor. The chandelier's chain showed no signs of having been lowered and raised again. It was as if the 2 servants had simply floated up to meet the nooses, or the nooses had reached down to collect them beneath each body. Carved into the hardwood floor with the same impossible precision he'd seen on the veranda were the smoking symbols, but here there were only 2 marks, not 7. 2 souls, lesser offerings, perhaps, or different categories of sacrifice. Thaddeus felt his sanity beginning to fray. This defied every law of nature and reason he'd ever known, but the evidence of his senses could not be denied. 9 people were dead, 7 arranged outside with ritualistic precision, to strung up inside in this grotesque tableau. All of it is impossible. All of it is true. He turned to leave the parlor, desperate now to get outside, to fetch help from town, to gather witnesses so he wouldn't face this alone. But as he stepped toward the door, something on the writing desk caught his eye, a leather-bound volume he'd missed on his first inspection, tucked partially under a copy of Godey's Lady's Book and Prudence's Journal, the one Cornelius had mentioned. Thaddeus retrieved it with trembling hands and opened it to a random page. The date read April 3, 1848, 5 years ago. Shortly after the family's arrival, Cornelius thinks me foolish for my reservations about the property, but I know what I know. The gate was here before any Christians set foot in these hills. The natives avoided this place. I learned this from a Mohican woman in the town market who became visibly distressed when I mentioned where we'd settled. She called it Coconut, the hanging place. She said her people had stories going back to before memory, stories of something that lived beneath the hill, something that demanded tribute. 7 souls every 20 years, she claimed. 7 souls to feed it and keep it satisfied, to prevent it from spreading its hunger beyond the bounds of this cursed acre. I asked her what would happen if the tribute wasn't paid. She wouldn't answer, only made a sign against evil and hurried away. But I saw the fear in her eyes. Whatever dwells here, the original inhabitants knew of it and avoided it for very good reason. I tried to tell Cornelius, but he laughed it off as superstition. He's a modern man, educated in the sciences, too rational to believe in native legends. But I've seen what I've seen. The gate moves when no one watches it directly. The symbols carved into its iron shift and flow. And at night, when the house is quiet, I hear singing voices in harmony, dozens of them, all swaying together in some awful chorus beneath the earth. Thaddeus closed the journal and pressed it against his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. Every 20 years, he did the mathematics quickly. If the Pemberton family had disappeared in 1804, and the Ashford family before them, but he didn't know all the dates. He needed to get to town, to the church records, to trace the full history of this property and learn how many families had been consumed by whatever dwelt here. The chandelier creaked above him. Mehitabel and Silas continued their gentle swaying, forever frozen in their silent conversation. Through the parlor window, Thaddeus could see a corner of the veranda and the edge of young Josiah's hanging form, small and terrible in the growing daylight. He had to leave. I had to get away from this house of death and bring back help. But as he turned toward the entrance hall, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The vase of chrysanthemums on the hall table had changed position. He was certain, absolutely certain, that it had been centered between the candlesticks when he entered. But now it sat slightly to the left, perhaps 3 inches off center, as if someone had moved it while his attention was elsewhere. And in the mirror above the table, he could see the reflection of the parlor behind him, could see the chandelier with its grim burden, could see himself standing in the doorway. But in the reflection there were 9 figures hanging from the chandelier. 7 more shadows had joined Mehitabel and Silas, all swaying in perfect rhythm, all facing inward toward the center of the room as if gathered for some infernal prayer meeting. Thaddeus turned slowly, knowing what he would find yet praying to be wrong. The parlor remained unchanged. Only the 2 servants hung from the fixture, but when he looked back at the mirror, 9 figures still swayed in its silvered surface. And now, God help him now, they were all turning their heads to look directly at him, their dead eyes filled with terrible awareness, their mouths opening to speak words he couldn't hear but felt vibrating in his bones. He ran through the entrance hall, past the impossible chrysanthemums, past the grandfather clock that began to chime again as he passed 3 strokes, then 3 more. Then 3 more ran out the door and down the veranda steps and past the 7 hanging Whitmores, who swayed in unison as if blown by his passage. Though no wind touched him, he didn't stop running until he reached the welcome gate, and there, gripping the iron archway for support while he caught his breath, he saw them, fresh names carved into the metal beneath Whitmore, still smoking, letters formed in that same alien script he'd seen throughout the house, names that, as he watched, began to shift and resolve into readable English. His name, Thaddeus Crane, and below it more names appear one by one, as if being written by an invisible hand. Obadiah Marsh, Gideon Blackwood, Ezekiel Hobbs. 4 more appeared, names he didn't immediately recognize, but he knew with sick certainty that they were the names of those who would next answer the gate's call. 7 more souls to satisfy the hunger, 7 more to join the eternal chorus, and the count had already begun. Thaddeus stumbled down the path from the Whitmore estate, his lungs burning, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed. The names carved into the gate haunted him, his own name, smoking and fresh, alongside 6 others marked for whatever horror had claimed the He needed help, needed witnesses, needed someone to tell him he wasn't losing his sanity on this cursed hill. The walk to Ashford Hollow took him nearly 2 hours on foot, his mare having fled God knew where. The October sun climbed higher, burning away the fog, but doing nothing to warm the cold that had settled into his bones. He passed farms and cottages, their chimneys smoking peacefully, their inhabitants going about ordinary morning tasks, milking cows, chopping wood, hanging laundry. The normalcy of it felt obscene after what he'd left behind. The town proper consisted of a single main street lined with clapboard buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a tavern, a church with a modest steeple, and perhaps 20 houses clustered around the commercial center. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where strangers were noticed immediately, and where the past pressed close against the present like a living thing. Thaddeus made directly for the Red Heart Tavern, knowing he'd find men there even at this early hour. He burst through the door to find exactly what he'd expected, a handful of local farmers nursing morning cider, the tavern keeper Jeremiah Hatch wiping down his bar, and in the corner booth, Reverend Obadiah Marsh and Dr. Gideon Blackwood engaged in their customary chess match, every head turned at his entrance. Thaddeus knew he must look wild, mud-splattered, pale as death, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Whitmores, he managed, gripping the doorframe for support, all dead hanged, every last one of them. The tavern went silent. Then Jeremiah Hatch set down his rag very carefully and said in a voice empty of surprise, "The gate took them." Then those 5 words confirmed Thaddeus's worst fears. They knew, the town knew about the gate, about the property, about whatever malevolent force dwelt on Gallows Hill. They'd known and said nothing, had let the Whitmore family walk unknowing into damnation. You knew. Thaddeus crossed the room in 3 strides, slamming his hands on the bar. You knew that land was cursed and you let them settle there. Let them raise children there. Reverend Marsh stood from the chess table, his considerable height and somber black clothing giving him the appearance of a crow rising from carrion. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by more. "We tried to warn them," Marsh said quietly. "When Cornelius Whitmore first inquired about purchasing the property, I personally visited him in Boston, told him the land had a dark history, told him 3 previous families had met unfortunate ends there." "Unfortunate ends?" Thaddeus's voice cracked. "I found 9 people hanged, Reverend, 7 arranged like musical notes on a staff, 2 servants strung up in the parlor. Their bodies defied every law of nature in how they were positioned, symbols carved into the floors, still smoking. And the gate." He stopped, unsure how to articulate what he'd seen in that iron archway. Dr. Blackwood joined them, a lean man with scholarly spectacles and the precise movements of someone who'd spent his life dealing with the mechanics of human bodies. "The symbols are the worst part," he said. "They appear on the bodies too, don't they? Under the tongues, usually, sometimes carved into the soles of the feet where they won't be noticed until examination." Thaddeus stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I examined the Pemberton bodies in 1804, Blackwood said. "I was just beginning my practice then, 23 years old and full of certainty that science could explain all phenomena. The Pembertons cured me of that arrogance." He gestured to a table. "Sit, Marshall. You look ready to collapse. Jeremiah, bring whiskey." The good bottle. Thaddeus allowed himself to be guided to a chair. Around them, the local farmers had quietly departed, leaving only the 4 Methodies, the Reverend, the doctor, and the tavern keeper, who poured generous measures of amber liquid into 4 glasses. "Tell us exactly what you found," Marsh said. Every detail, no matter how strange. Thaddeus recounted it, all the 7 family members arranged by height, the 2 servants murdered in the parlor, Cornelius's journal and its references to the visits, Aunt Prudence's account of native warnings about Coconock, the hanging place. He told them about the impossible chronology of the grandfather clock, about the reflections in the mirror showing 9 figures instead of 2, about the names appearing on the gate. When he finished, the 3 men exchanged glances heavy with meaning. "The pattern holds," Blackwood said. "Every 20 years, almost to the day, the Ashford family in 1691 disappeared. October 20th, the Pemberton family in 1804 found, hanging October 22nd, the Whitmore family now in 1853, October 23rd, by your account." "But why?" Thaddeus demanded. "What possible purpose does this serve? What is the gate?" Reverend Marsh drained his whiskey before answering. "No one knows its true origin. The Mahacan people called it Coconock and avoided this area entirely. When the first European settlers arrived in the 1680s, they found it already standing, the iron archway, the stone pillars, the symbols. The Ashford family, newly arrived from Salem, believed they could tame it, make it serve as the welcoming entrance to their homestead. They built their house around it rather than removing it, thinking themselves clever for incorporating such fine metalwork into their property. They lasted 9 years," Hatch interjected. "Then one October morning, neighbors found the entire family strung up from their porch rafters. 8 people, parents, 5 children, and an elderly grandmother, all hanged in order of height. The authorities at the time ruled it mass murder-suicide, claimed the father had gone mad, but those who examined the scene closely knew better. The bodies had been positioned with impossible precision, and the symbols were everywhere." Blackwood leaned forward. "The property sat empty for 57 years after that. Then in 1748, the Rutherford family purchased it, cleared away the ruins of the Ashford home, and built a new structure. They were wealthy merchants from Philadelphia, skeptical of local superstitions. They lasted 10 years. All 7 of them were found hanging from their barn rafters in October 1758. Same arrangement, same symbols." Then came the Pembertons in 1794, Marsh continued. The father was a professor of antiquities who'd heard the stories and wanted to study the gate. Though his education made him immune to whatever primitive forces might dwell there, he kept meticulous records. I have some of his papers in the church archive. He documented everything, the midnight singing, the way shadows moved wrong, how reflections showed the dead hanging even when no bodies were present. He understood, near the end, that the gate was only the visible portion of something far larger buried beneath Gallows Hill. What do you mean, buried beneath? Thaddeus asked. The professor believed the gate was an anchor point, Blackwood explained. That something, some entity or force existed in layers of reality adjacent to our own. And the gate served as the threshold between worlds. Every 20 years, it required tribute to maintain the boundary. 7 souls hanged at the gate, their life force somehow feeding whatever dwelt below. That's madness, Thaddeus said, but his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. He'd seen the evidence. He'd felt the wrongness emanating from that iron archway. After the Pembertons, the town council voted to leave the property abandoned. Marsh said, "We let it sit empty for 49 years, let the forest reclaim it, hoping the gate would rust away or be buried by time. But the gate doesn't corrode, doesn't age. 5 years ago, when Cornelius Whitmore inquired about purchasing land in our area, someone, I won't say who, saw an opportunity to rid ourselves of the problem. You sold them to it," Thaddeus said, horror and disgust warring in his voice. "You knowingly sent that family to their deaths." "We warned them." Marsh's composure cracked. "I personally explained the history. But Whitmore was a modern man, educated, rational. He laughed at tales of cursed ground and hungry gates, said he'd bought the property for a fraction of its value and considered himself fortunate. What could we do? Physically bar him from land he'd legally purchased? He had every right. He had 4 children," Thaddeus interrupted. "That little boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old. You let them move an 8-year-old child onto land you knew was cursed." Silence fell over the table. Outside, normal life continued. A wagon rolled past. Someone called a greeting. A dog barked. Inside the Red Hart Tavern, 4 men contemplated the weight of complicity and guilt. Finally, Hatch spoke. "What's done is done. The question now is what happens next. You said you saw names on the gate. Marshall, yours among them." Thaddeus nodded grimly. "Mine, plus 6 others. The Reverend's name, the doctor's, Ezekiel Hobbsey's the one who sent me the message this morning. 3 others I didn't recognize." 7, Blackwood said. "Always 7. The pattern holds. We're marked now. Those who discovered the bodies, who witnessed the aftermath. The gate has noticed us." "That's ridiculous," Thaddeus said, but his hand instinctively went to his neck, touching the spot where phantom rope burns seemed to itch. "We're not living on the property. We haven't answered any midnight calls. We're not. The Pemberton journals documented it," Marsh interrupted. "The professor wrote that witnesses to the hangings sometimes became incorporated into the next cycle. Not always, but sometimes. As if the gate preferred those who already knew its power, who'd seen what it could do. Terror makes the feeding sweeter," he theorized. Thaddeus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floorboards. "I won't accept this. There has to be a way to stop it. We burn the gate, tear it down, bury it. It's been tried," Blackwood said wearily. "After the Rutherford deaths, locals attempted to destroy the gate with sledgehammers and fire. The tools broke against the iron, the flames wouldn't catch. 3 men involved in the attempt later killed themselves, hanged themselves from their own front porches within a week of touching the gate with intent to harm it. Then we leave," Thaddeus said. "We pack up and go, put 100 miles between ourselves and this cursed town." "The professor tried that too," Marsh said. "Loaded his family into a wagon and fled when he realized what was coming. They made it as far as Springfield, 40 miles distant, before something compelled them to turn around. They were found 3 days later back at the property, their bodies hung from the gate itself, so mutilated that identification was only possible through their clothing. Whatever the gate wants, it gets. Distance means nothing to it." Thaddeus sank back into his chair, the full horror of his situation settling over him like a shroud. He was marked. They all were. 7 souls to feed the hunger, and his name had been carved in smoking metal alongside 6 others. He asked quietly, "How long do we have?" "The cycle typically completes within a lunar month," Blackwood said. 4 weeks from the initial hangings, time enough to feel hope, to try desperate measures, to understand the futility of resistance. The gate enjoys the chase, I think, enjoys watching its chosen spiral into despair. There has to be something in those journals," Thaddeus insisted. "Some clues, some weaknesses we can exploit." I found Cornelius Whitmore's journal and Aunt Prudence's. You said you have the professor's papers. We need to study them all, find the pattern, and understand what we're facing. Marsh nodded slowly. The church archive holds what survived of the Pemberton documents, and old Isaiah Crawford, who lives out past Miller's Creek, his grandfather was one of the men who found the Ashford bodies in 1691. The family kept records, oral histories passed down. We could speak with him. Then we start there, Thaddeus said, forcing steel into his voice. We research, we investigate, we find a way to break this curse or die trying, because I'll be damned if I walk willingly to that gate and put a noose around my own neck. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him, felt the invisible thread connecting him to that iron archway, already beginning to pull. In his mind's eye he could see himself hanging there in perfect arrangement with 6 others, swaying gently in the windless air, his face turned toward the gate in eternal greeting. The gate was patient, the gate was hungry. And the gate always got what it wanted. The web of horror is spreading 7 new souls marked by the gate's hunger. What do you think Thaddeus and the others will discover in those old journals? Can they break the curse, or are they already doomed? Drop your predictions in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. This story is about to get even darker. Dr. Gideon. Blackwood Surgery occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building at the edge of Ashford Hollow's Main Street. The examination room smelled of carbolic acid and something darker, the sweet, cloying scent that clung to places where death was studied rather than mourned. Thaddeus stood near the door, watching as the doctor prepared his instruments with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd cut into more corpses than he cared to count. The bodies arrived an hour ago, Blackwood said, gesturing to the 7 forms laid out on examination tables. Sheets covered them, but the varying sizes made clear which was which. From Cornelius's tall frame to little Josiah's heartbreakingly small shape, Ezekiel Hobbs and his sons helped me transport them. Poor Ezekiel hasn't spoken a word since. Just keep making that sign against evil and muttering prayers. He's one of the marks, Thaddeus said quietly. His name was on the gate. Blackwood's hands stilled momentarily over his instruments. Then he knows what's coming. Perhaps silence is the most rational response. He selected a scalpel, tested its edge against his thumb. Are you certain you want to observe this, Marshal? It won't be pleasant. I need to understand what killed them. If there's any physical evidence that might help us, there won't be, Blackwood interrupted. But I'll show you anyway. Sometimes bearing witness is all we can do. He pulled back the sheet covering Cornelius Whitmore's body. The patriarch lay pale and waxy in death, his neck bearing the deep ligature mark I would expect from hanging. Blackwood began his examination with clinical precision, calling out his observations as he worked. External examination shows classic signs of asphyxial death: petechial, hemorrhaging in the eyes, protruding tongue, lividity consistent with vertical suspension. He palpated the neck carefully. But here's the first anomaly. The hyoid bone is intact. In hanging deaths, especially when there's a drop involved, we typically see fractures of the hyoid or cervical vertebrae. Mr. Whitmore's neck shows no such trauma. What does that mean? Thaddeus asked. It means he didn't die from the hanging itself. The rope didn't break his neck, and he didn't asphyxiate over time as one would expect. Blackwood made a neat incision, peeling back tissue to expose the throat structure. Look here, the trachea shows minimal damage. The carotid arteries are intact. By all physiological measures, this man should have survived the hanging, at least for the several minutes it would take to strangle, yet he was unquestionably dead before rigidity set in. He moved to examine the wrists and ankles, where Thaddeus had noticed the rope burns. Ligature marks here, but no corresponding ropes found at the scene. He was bound, then unbound, then hanged. The sequence makes no sense from a murder perspective. Why bind someone, release them, then hang them, especially when they're somehow already deceased? Blackwood worked in silence for several minutes, making precise incisions, examining internal organs. Finally, he stepped back from the table, his expression troubled. Marshal, I've examined dozens of hanging victims in my career. I know what death by asphyxiation looks like at every stage, from initial oxygen deprivation to final cellular death. This isn't it. Cornelius Whitmore's organs show no signs of oxygen starvation. His blood pooled as if his heart simply stopped beating while he was standing upright, and then somehow he was positioned beneath that veranda and suspended. You're saying he was dead before he was hanged? I'm saying he was dead, yet somehow still ambulatory, still able to walk to the veranda, position himself precisely, place the noose around his own neck. Blackwood's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I'm saying something that animated his corpse long enough to arrange the scene we discovered. Thaddeus felt his stomach turn. That's impossible. So are smoking symbols carved into wood and iron. So are reflections that show the dead still, hanging when no bodies are present. Impossible seems to be the natural state of affairs where that gate is concerned. Blackwood moved to the sink, scrubbing blood from his hands. But there's more. Come look at this. He returned to Cornelius's body and used a small hook to lift the tongue. Beneath it, carved with surgical precision into the soft tissue, was one of the symbols, the same alien markings Thaddeus had seen throughout the Whitmore house. It's on all of them, Blackwood said. Every family member, both servants, the same symbol, cut to identical depth, positioned in exactly the same location. And look closely, the edges of the carving are cauterized, as if seared by intense heat. Yet the surrounding tissue shows no burn damage. Whatever made these marks was impossibly precise and impossibly hot. Thaddeus examined the symbol closely, fighting revulsion. Up close, he could see that it wasn't random, it had structure, geometry, purpose. 3 curved lines intersecting at specific angles, forming a pattern that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally, though it remained static when looked at directly. Professor Pemberton's papers included sketches of this symbol, Blackwood continued. He called it a binding mark, theorized it was some form of spiritual signature that marked souls as property of whatever dwelt beneath the hill. Once marked, you belonged to the gate. Your fate was sealed. He covered Cornelius's body and moved to examine Marguerite. The process repeated no physiological cause of death, the same symbol carved beneath the tongue, the same evidence that she'd been dead yet somehow mobile when she was positioned for hanging. The children were worse. Thaddeus had to turn away when Blackwood examined young Josiah, unable to bear the clinical dissection of a child's body. But the doctor's findings remained consistent. They had all died standing upright, hearts simply ceasing to beat, then walking as corpses to their appointed deaths. The servants showed different trauma, Blackwood noted as he examined Mehitable Good. She fought. You can see the defensive wounds, the torn fingernails where she clawed at the noose. But here's what's strange, she has the symbol too, marked at least 12 hours before death. She was chosen by the gate, marked as one of the 7, yet she resisted. The Whitmores went willingly, understanding what was required. Mehitable and Silas were forced. Does resistance make a difference? Thaddeus asked. Can we fight it? They still died, Blackwood said simply. Perhaps fighting only prolongs the agony. Professor Pemberton's wife tried to resist his journals, document her increasing hysteria as the date approached. Her attempts to flee, to hide, to barricade herself in a locked room. She was found hanging with the others, her body showing signs of such extreme struggle that her spine had been damaged. But she hanged nonetheless. Thaddeus moved to the window, needing air that didn't taste of death and carbolic acid. Outside, normal life continued, merchants hawking wares, children playing, horses pulling carts. How could the world continue so ordinarily when such horror existed mere miles away? There's one more thing, Blackwood said, something I need to show you, though I warn you it will provide more questions than answers. He led Thaddeus to a cabinet at the back of the surgery and withdrew a wooden box about the size of a Bible. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay several objects, fragments of rope, pieces of iron, samples of wood, all bearing the smoking symbols. These are from the Pemberton hanging, Blackwood explained. I collected them in 1804, thinking they might provide evidence useful to understanding what occurred. The rope fragments should have rotted by now, it's been 49 years. But look, he unwrapped one piece, and Thaddeus saw that the fibers appeared fresh, almost new, and when Blackwood held it up to the light, the symbol carved into its twisted length glowed faintly, as if lit from within. They don't age, Blackwood continued, don't decay. The gate preserves what it touches, and if you hold them too long, he set the rope down quickly. You begin to feel it calling, begin to understand why those marked cannot escape. The gate's influence is physical, transferable through objects it's claimed. Every rope that hangs a victim becomes part of it. Every board that bears its mark. The entire property is an extension of whatever intelligence dwells there. Thaddeus stared at the artifacts, feeling a cold certainty settle over him. We can't fight it, that's what you're saying. These examinations prove that resistance is futile. I'm saying that every previous attempt to resist has failed, Blackwood corrected. But perhaps we're asking the wrong questions. Professor Pemberton focused on how to fight the gate. What if instead we should ask why it exists? What purpose does it serve? What would happen if it went unfed? You think starving it might destroy it? I think the professor's research suggested the gate isn't the source of the horror, it's a containment system, that something far worse dwells beneath Gallows Hill, and the gate keeps it imprisoned. The 7 souls aren't consumed by the gate itself, but used to maintain whatever barrier keeps the deeper evil trapped. Thaddeus absorbed this, the implications staggering. So if we refuse to feed it, if we somehow prevent the 7 marks from hanging, we might not be saving ourselves, we might be releasing something worse. The professor theorized as much in his final writings. He believed the hangings were humanity's tribute to keep something ancient and terrible locked away. A bargain made centuries ago, perhaps millennia, long before recorded history. 7 lives every 20 years to spare millions from whatever would emerge if the barrier failed. That's monstrous. You're suggesting we should walk willingly to our deaths to preserve this devil's bargain? Blackwood's expression hardened. I'm suggesting we need more information before we make decisions that might doom far more than 7 souls. Reverend Marsh has arranged for us to visit Isaiah Crawford this afternoon. His family's oral histories go back to the first European contact with the gate. Perhaps he knows something the written records don't contain. Thaddeus looked back at the sheet-covered bodies, at the artifacts that defied natural law, at the symbols that glowed with malevolent purpose. Every answer bred more questions, every discovery deepened the mystery. But one thing remained clear: they had less than 4 weeks to understand what they faced, and find a way to either break the curse or accept their fate. What do we tell the families? He asked. The Whitmores have relations in Boston. The servants have people in town. They'll want answers. We tell them what the authorities have always told them: mass murder, suicide, driven by madness. It's kinder than the truth. Blackwood began covering his instruments. And it maintains the pattern. Every 20 years, another family succumbs to the curse of Gallows Hill. The town grieves, buries the dead, and waits for the cycle to repeat. It's how we've survived for a century and a half. By lying, by sending innocents to slaughter, by accepting that some horrors cannot be defeated, only endured. Blackwood met his eyes. You're marked now, Marshall. You're part of the pattern. The question isn't whether you'll hang, it's whether you'll do so understanding why, accepting your role in something larger than yourself, or whether you'll fight and suffer as Mehitable Good suffered, torn and broken but hanging nonetheless. Thaddeus turned and walked out of the surgery, unable to bear another moment in that charnel house of failed resistance. Behind him, Dr. Blackwood began preparing the bodies for burial, humming a tune that sounded disturbingly like the midnight singing Cornelius Whitmore had described in his journal. The gate was patient. The gate was hungry. And one way or another, the gate would be fed. The sun hung low over the Berkshire Hills as Thaddeus, Reverend Marsh, and Dr. Blackwood rode toward the Whitmore estate. Their afternoon visit to Isaiah Crawford had yielded disturbing revelations, oral histories describing the gate as the mouth of the deep, accounts of native peoples performing rituals to keep it dormant, warnings that the 20-year cycle was merely the visible portion of something far more complex. The old man had pressed a leather pouch into Thaddeus's hands, filled with dried herbs and stones carved with protective symbols. Won't stop the gate, Crawford had wheezed, but might buy you time to understand it. Now, against every instinct of self-preservation, the 3 men approached the property for a night vigil. Reverend Marsh carried his Bible and a flask of holy water blessed at 3 consecutive midnight masses. Blackwood brought his medical bag and a notebook for documentation. Thaddeus carried his pistol and a growing certainty that they were making a terrible mistake. This is madness, he said as they dismounted at the tree line, well back from the gate. The bodies had been removed that afternoon, but the ropes still hung from the veranda like obscene party decorations. We should be fleeing, not walking deliberately into danger. We need to witness what happens after dark, Marsh insisted. Every account mentions midnight phenomena. If we're to have any hope of understanding how to break this curse, we must observe it directly. They tethered their horses far from the property. The animals were already ears flat against their skulls, nostrils flaring at some scent humans couldn't detect. The 3 men approached on foot, each carrying a lantern, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the dying light. The house loomed before them, dark and silent. No lamplight glowed in the windows. No smoke rose from the chimneys. It had the abandoned quality of places where great tragedy had occurred, as if the very walls had absorbed so much horror they could no longer maintain the pretense of shelter. We'll position ourselves in the parlor, Blackwood said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Maximum visibility of both the interior and the veranda. We stay together. No one investigates sounds alone, and if anything at all seems to be compelling us toward the gate, the others physically restrain that person. Agreed. They murmured assent and entered through the front door, which stood ajar as Thaddeus had left it that morning. Inside the house was cold despite the mild October evening. Their breath misted in the lamplight as they made their way to the parlor. The chandelier hung empty now, Mehitable and Silas's bodies having been cut down and removed, but the symbols carved into the floor beneath where they'd hung still smoked faintly, wisps of vapor rising in the lamplight like souls ascending, or descending. They arranged 3 chairs in a triangle facing outward, each man watching a different approach. Reverend Marsh produced his Bible and began reading Psalms in a low, steady voice. Blackwood opened his notebook and began documenting observations with scientific precision: temperature, air quality, the exact time of sunset. Thaddeus simply sat with his pistol across his knees and waited. Nothing happened for hours. The house settled around them with the normal creaks and groans of aging wood. Outside, autumn insects sang their evening chorus. A barn owl called from the woods. The normalcy of it was almost worse than overt supernatural manifestation, the tension of waiting for horror that refused to arrive. At 11:30, Reverend Marsh paused his reading. "Do you feel that?" Thaddeus did. The temperature had dropped precipitously in the space of moments, his breath now fogging thick in the lamplight. The insect chorus had ceased. The owl had gone silent. That same oppressive quiet he'd experienced at dawn settled over the property like a suffocating blanket. "It's beginning," Blackwood whispered, his pen poised over his notebook. At precisely midnight, Thaddeus checked his pocket watch to confirm the hour. Every lamp in the parlor guttered and died simultaneously, though there was no wind, no draft, nothing to explain the sudden darkness. For a moment they sat in absolute blackness, 3 men breathing in panicked unison. Then the veranda illuminated. Pale blue-white light flooded through the parlor windows, casting everything in stark relief. Thaddeus rushed to the window and stared in disbelief. The veranda glowed with luminescence that had no visible source, not lamplight, not moonlight, but something that seemed to emanate from the very boards themselves. And the ropes, the 7 empty ropes that had held the Whitmore family, were swaying in perfect rhythm, back and forth, despite the windless night. And they weren't empty. Shadows filled them, silhouettes of hanged figures, detailed enough to distinguish individual family members. There was Cornelius, tall and distinguished even in death's shadow. There was Marguerite beside him, her hair streaming as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. The children in descending order, young Josiah's small form at the end, feet dangling inches above the veranda boards. "Dear God," Marsh breathed, "they're still here. Their souls are still trapped." The shadows began to move. Not the gentle swaying of suspended bodies, but deliberate motion, heads turning, arms reaching out, mouths opening in silent screams or perhaps song. And from somewhere beneath the hill, rising through the floorboards like water seeping through cracks, came sound, singing, dozens of voices raised in harmony, wordless but achingly beautiful. A melody that predated language and bypassed rational thought to resonate directly in the hindbrain. Thaddeus felt it vibrating in his bones, felt his body responding with an urge to move, to sway, to join that eternal chorus. He took a step toward the door. "Marshall." "No." Blackwood grabbed his arm, but Thaddeus barely registered the touch. The singing was everything, drowning out thought, drowning out fear, replacing every impulse with one overwhelming need: to go outside, to take his place among the ropes, to add his voice to that magnificent hymn. He took another step. The door was so close, just a few yards away. Beyond it, the veranda beckoned with its cold light. The shadows were turning now, all 7 of them rotating to face the windows, to look directly at him, welcoming him home. "Thaddeus, fight it." Marsh seized his other arm. The 2 men wrestled him backward, away from the door, but he fought them with surprising strength. He could see himself hanging there, see exactly where he belonged, the 8th position, extending the descending line, completing some mathematical equation that the universe demanded be solved. Blackwood produced a vial from his medical bag and smashed it under Thaddeus's nose. The sharp ammonia stench cut through the singing's enchantment like a knife. Thaddeus gasped, blinked, suddenly aware that he'd been halfway to the door, straining against his companion's grip with single-minded determination. "Jesus Christ," he panted. "I couldn't stop myself. I was going to." "We all felt it," Marsh said, and Thaddeus saw that both men's faces were slick with sweat, their expressions showing the strain of their own battles against compulsion. "The call is strong, stronger than I imagined." The singing continued, building in complexity. More voices joined the chorus, not just the 7 Whitmores, but dozens, perhaps hundreds of voices stretching back through time. Every soul that had fed the gate, every victim across the centuries. all singing together in that horrible, beautiful harmony. Through the windows, they watched as the shadows on the veranda began to multiply. More hanged figures appeared, layer upon layer of transparent forms occupying the same space. Men, women, children of every era, their clothing spanning from colonial homespun to recent fashion, all swaying in unison, all facing the gate. The professor was right, Blackwood whispered, his scientific composure cracking. Every soul the gate has taken remains bound to it. They're not consumed, they're collected, added to some massive spiritual reservoir. That he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. Thaddeus followed his gaze and felt his heart seize in his chest. Words were appearing on the parlor mirror, written in condensation that shouldn't exist in the freezing room. Letter by letter, they formed. 7 more, feed the mouth, 7 more, join the chorus, deep grows, Reese come willing, and no peace come fighting, and no agony but come mus. Beneath the words, 7 names appeared in that same impossible frost. Thaddeus Crane, Obadiah Marsh, Gideon Blackwood, Ezekiel Hobbs, Mercy Holland, Constance Pruitt, Silas Wickham. Who are Mercy Holland, Constance Pruitt, and Silas Wickham? Thaddeus demanded. I don't know those names. Mercy Holland runs the boarding house, Marsh said quietly. Constance Pruitt is a widow who lives alone past the mill. And Silas Wickham, he paused, his face going pale. Silas Wickham was the carpenter who built the Whitmore's veranda. He reinforced the beams that held the ropes. The gate chooses carefully, Blackwood observed, his voice hollow. Not random victims, but those connected to the property, to the previous deaths, to the physical apparatus of hanging itself. It creates a web, drawing in everyone who touches the cycle. The singing reached a crescendo, so loud now it seemed to shake the walls. And then, impossibly, they heard words not in English or any earthly language, but somehow comprehensible, translating directly in their minds. We who hang at the threshold keep the deep in. We who swing in eternal dance hold back the tide of what dwells below. 7 more souls to strengthen the chains. 7 more voices to reinforce the song. This is mercy. This is salvation. Your deaths preserve millions. Come willing. Come grateful. Come singing. Thaddeus clapped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block the voice that spoke inside his skull. Beside him, Reverend Marsh had fallen to his knees, his Bible tumbling from nerveless fingers. Blackwood stood transfixed, tears streaming down his face, staring at something beyond the visible world. I see them, the doctor whispered. I see what the gate holds back. Oh God, if that ever breaks free, what? Thaddeus grabbed him. What do you see? But Blackwood only shook his head, his eyes unfocused, his lips moving in silent calculation. The mathematics of it, the spiritual physics. 7 souls generate enough life energy to maintain the barrier for 20 years. But it's weakening. Each cycle requires more sacrifice, generates less containment. Eventually, maybe decades, maybe centuries, but eventually, 7 won't be enough. Then 70, then 700, and when we can no longer pay the price, he stopped, gasping, as if he'd run a great distance. We have to hang, don't you understand? We have to, or something worse than death will be unleashed. The gate isn't evil, it's a dam, and where the water it needs to keep holding back the flood. A sound like thunder rolled beneath their feet. The floorboards buckled and warped, and through the cracks, that blue-white light began to seep, along with a smell like ocean depths and rotting stone. From below, from far below, something responded to Blackwood's revelation, a presence so vast and alien that merely sensing its outline was enough to shatter sanity. Marsh screamed, out now, before it rises. They fled the parlor, stumbling through the entrance hall as the house shook around them. Behind them, the chandelier fell, crashing to the floor in an explosion of crystal and brass. The mirror shattered, spraying glass shards that sang like chimes as they scattered across the boards. The grandfather clock began chiming 3 strokes, 3 strokes, 3 strokes. Endless repetition of that terrible number. They burst through the front door and ran past the veranda where the shadow figures still swayed, ran past the gate that hummed with satisfaction at their terror. Ran until they reached their horses and galloped wildly into the night. None of them looked back. None of them spoke. They rode in silence until they reached the edge of town, and only then did Thaddeus reach up to touch his neck. Fresh rope burns encircled his throat, weeping clear fluid. He looked at his companions and saw the same marks on them, livid welts, as if they'd already worn the noose, as if their bodies were being prepared for what was to come. And under his tongue, he felt it with his finger-raised area, warm to the touch. Shaped like the symbol he'd seen carved into the Whitmores. The gate had marked him, not just in name but in flesh. They had, 27 days until the cycle demanded completion. And the counting had truly begun. 3 weeks passed like a fever dream. Thaddeus tried to maintain his duties as deputy marshal, but the rope burns on his neck never healed. They wept constantly, staining his collar with clear fluid that smelled faintly of iron and something older, earthy, like soil from a deep grave. Dr. Blackwood examined them daily, documenting their progression with the detached fascination of a man studying his own terminal illness. The burns were spreading, creeping downward toward his collarbones, upward toward his jaw, as if invisible rope tightened incrementally with each passing day. The symbol under his tongue had grown. Blackwood confirmed it with mirror examinations. The carved mark was extending roots through the soft tissue, branching like the mycelium of some parasitic fungus. When Thaddeus ate, he tasted copper. When he spoke, his words sometimes emerged in that wordless harmony they'd heard during the night vigil, syllables that predated language and hurt the throat to produce. He wasn't alone in his suffering. Reverend Marsh had stopped sleeping. Dark crescents hollowed his eyes, and his sermons had taken on a frantic, apocalyptic quality that disturbed his congregation. He preached about necessary sacrifices, about 7 seals and 7 trumpets, about the mathematics of damnation and salvation. After the third such sermon, the church elders quietly suggested he take a sabbatical for his health. He'd laughed a broken, desperate sound, and told them his health was the least of anyone's concerns. Dr. Blackwood had become obsessed with the artifacts in his surgery. He spent hours holding the rope fragments from the Pemberton hanging, letting that interior voice speak to him, transcribing revelations in notebooks he kept locked away. His hands shook constantly now. He'd lost 15 pounds. When Thaddeus visited him, he found the doctor surrounded by complex mathematical equations scrawled across every available surface floor, even his own arms, trying to calculate exactly how many souls the gate had collected, how much spiritual energy it had accumulated, how long before the containment failed entirely. 6,312. Blackwood had told him yesterday, his eyes glassy and unfocused. That's my conservative estimate. 162 cycles of 7 souls each, going back 3,240 years, possibly longer. The gate is ancient, Thaddeus, old when the pyramids were new, and every soul it's collected still hangs there in layers of reality we can't perceive. 6,000 voices singing to keep the deep in prison. Ezekiel Hobbs had tried to run. They found him 3 days later, 40 miles west, near the New York border, hanging from a tree in his night. His horse stood nearby, head bowed, as if keeping vigil. When they cut him down, they discovered he'd clawed his own throat raw trying to remove a rope that wasn't physically there. The symbol under his tongue had spread to cover his entire oral cavity, and carved into the tree trunk above where he'd hung were the words, "Distance means nothing. Return or be dragged." They buried him in the town cemetery, and the next morning his grave stood empty, the earth disturbed but the body gone. Thaddeus didn't need to investigate to know where Ezekiel now hung on the Whitmore Veranda, first of the 7 new offerings, his corpse swaying gently in preparation for the others to join him. 6 names remained on the gate, 6 souls left to satisfy the cycle. The 3 women marked by the gate had fared no better. Mercy Holland, the boarding house proprietor, had barricaded herself in her room and refused all visitors. Through her door, boarders heard her singing that same wordless harmony, hour after hour, until her voice went hoarse and then continued anyway, a rasping whisper that never ceased. When Thaddeus forced entry on the 20th day, concerned for her welfare, he found her hanging from the ceiling beam, her body already cold, the rope marks on her neck predating her death by at least a week. She'd been dead for days, yet somehow still moving through her daily routines, fooling everyone until the gate finally called her home. Constance Pruitt, the widow, had walked calmly to the Whitmore estate on the 22nd day. Multiple witnesses saw her pass through town in her nightgown, walking with purpose despite the morning hour, her eyes fixed on some distant point only she could see. They tried to stop her, but she walked through their restraining hands like smoke, insubstantial when they reached for her, yet solid enough to leave footprints in the dust. By the time Thaddeus rode after her, she was already hanging beside Ezekiel on the veranda, arranged in precise height order, her face serene. Silas Wickham, the carpenter who'd built the veranda that bore the hanging victims, lasted until the 25th day. He spent his final week building a scaffold in his own front yard, leadened woodwork showing his master craftsmanship, complete with professionally constructed gallows. His neighbors watched in horror as he worked day and night, humming that terrible melody. On the morning of the 25th day, he climbed his creation, positioned the noose around his own neck, and stepped off with a smile on his face. His last words, shouted to the assembled crowd. I understand now. The gate is mercy. The deep must be fed. 3 souls left. 3 names still smoking on the iron archway. Thaddeus Crane, Obadiah Marsh, Gideon Blackwood. On the 27th day, as the full moon rose over Ashford Hollow, Thaddeus woke to find himself standing outside the Red Hart Tavern in his nightclothes. With no memory of leaving his boarding house, 6 figures stood around him in a loose circle, all in nightclothes, all wearing expressions of peaceful acceptance. He recognized them immediately, townspeople he'd known for years, upstanding citizens with families and responsibilities, but their eyes were wrong, dead eyes. Eyes that reflected that cold blue-white light even though no source was visible. They were already gone, these 6, their bodies animated by whatever force emanated from the gate, puppets of meat and bone, waiting to complete the final tableau. No, Thaddeus whispered, but his legs began moving of their own accord, walking him toward the edge of town, toward the path that led to Gallows Hill. The 6 figures fell into step around him, creating a procession. From the windows above, he heard shutters close, saw curtains draw. The town knew what was happening. The town always knew, and the town did nothing, because what could be done? He tried to fight, tried to turn back, but his body refused to obey. The symbol under his tongue burned like molten metal, and that interior voice spoke with gentle insistence. Come willing, come grateful. Your death preserves millions. This is the most noble purpose any soul could serve. Reverend Marsh appeared from an alley, also in nightclothes, also walking with that terrible purposeful stride. Their eyes met, and Thaddeus saw resignation there, mixed with something that might have been relief. The burden of knowledge was ending. The weight of terror would soon lift. In death, there would be a purpose. In hanging there would be meaning. Dr. Blackwood joined them at the town limits, completing the 7. He carried his notebook, still scribbling observations even as his legs carried him inexorably forward. Fascinating, he murmured. The compulsion bypasses all voluntary motor control. I can observe myself walking to my death yet cannot stop the process. The gate's influence operates at the autonomic level, perhaps even deeper. Gideon, Thaddeus, managed through clenched teeth. Fight it. We can still know, we can't. Blackwood interrupted, his voice eerily calm. I've done mathematics, Thaddeus. I've seen what the gate holds back. If we don't hang, if we somehow break free, the barrier weakens. And if the barrier fails, he stopped writing, looked up at the moon. There are things worse than death. Things that make death seem like a blessing. The gate is cruel, yes, but it's cruel in service of a greater mercy. 7 lives to save untold millions. The equation balances. They walked through the darkness, 7 figures in white nightclothes, processing like monks to vespers. The woods pressed close on either side, but nothing stirred in the undergrowth. Even the animals had fled, sensing what approached. Above, clouds obscured the stars, but that didn't matter. The path ahead glowed with its own illumination, a trail of blue-white light leading inexorably to the gate. The Whitmore estate materialized from the gloom. On the veranda, 4 figures already hung in perfect arrangement: Ezekiel, Mercy, Constance, and Silas, their bodies swaying in rhythm despite the windless night. They'd been positioned by height, leaving 3 obvious gaps in the descending line, 3 spaces waiting to be filled. 3 nooses hanging empty, rope fresh and strong, knots tied with professional precision by hands that had never been human. The gate stood before them, its iron archwork pulsing with that submarine light. The symbols carved into its surface flowed and shifted, and Thaddeus could read them now, not with his eyes, but with whatever part of his soul the gate had claimed. They told the history of this place in a language older than mankind. The deep had awakened millennia ago, breaking through from some other plane of existence, threatening to consume everything. The gate had been constructed by whom or what? The symbols didn't say as a prison, a threshold that required constant reinforcement, blood and souls and life energy, channeled through ritual sacrifice, maintaining the barrier between worlds, necessary. The gate whispered in his mind, eternal. Without us, the deep rises. Without our sacrifice, reality ends. We are not victims, we are guardians. We are the lock that keeps the door closed. Thaddeus's feet carried him up the veranda steps. The other 6 spread out to their appointed positions, filling in the gaps with mathematical precision. He found himself standing between Reverend Marsh and one of the reanimated townspeople whose name he couldn't remember. Looking down the line, he saw them arranged by height tallest to shortest, creating that same descending sequence the Whitmores had formed, that every group of victims had formed across the centuries. Musical notes on a staff, a song written in hanging bodies. Below each position, The symbols were already carved into the wood, smoking, waiting. The rope descended from the overhang, the noose positioned at exactly the right height. All he had to do was reach up, place it around his neck, and step forward. His body was already moving to comply, arms rising despite his mental screams of protest. The noose settled over his head, rough hemp scratching his throat where the rope burns had prepared the skin. It felt familiar. It felt right, like coming home after a long journey. No, the scream came from somewhere deep inside, some core of self that refused to accept this fate. Thaddeus's hands flew to the noose, clawing at it, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt his voluntary control return. He yanked the rope over his head and stumbled backward, gasping. The other 6 had already positioned their nooses. As Thaddeus watched in horror, they stepped forward in perfect unison. The ropes went taut, and 7 became 6. Their bodies dropped perhaps 3 inches, not enough to break necks, just enough to tighten the nooses end. Then they hung there, swaying, their feet dangling inches above the veranda boards. But they weren't struggling. They hung peacefully, their faces serene, and from their mouths came song, that wordless harmony joining the chorus of thousands that rose from beneath the hill. Even in death, they were singing. Even strangled and hanged, they were contributing their voices to the eternal hymn that held the deep imprisoned. Thaddeus stood alone, the last of the 7, the final note in the song unsung, and the gate was angry. The veranda shook, the house groaned. From beneath the hill came a sound like grinding stone, like continental plates shifting, like something immense stirring from eons of slumber. The symbols flared brighter, burning with cold fire that threw sharp shadows across the hanging bodies. And Thaddeus felt it, the barrier weakening, the prison door cracking, something vast and hungry pressing against the threshold, testing its bonds. Hang, the gate commanded. No longer gentle, no longer patient. Hang now, or the deep breaks free. Your refusal dooms millions. Hang willing or hang broken, but hang you must. His body locked rigid, muscles no longer under his control. The noose, lifted by invisible hands, positioned itself around his neck. He felt the rope tighten, felt his feet begin to leave the boards. This was it, the end, the inevitable conclusion to a cycle that had repeated for 3,000 years and would repeat for 3,000 more. But in that final moment, as the rope constricted and darkness began to close around his vision, Thaddeus Crane made a choice that no one marked by the gate had ever made before. He grabbed the rope above his head and pulled himself up, pulled with every ounce of strength remaining in his dying body. Pulled until he could hook his arms over the veranda beam, pulled until he'd lifted himself free of the noose. For 5 impossible seconds, he hung there by his arms, the rope swinging empty beneath him, the pattern broken, the song incomplete. 6 voices sang where 7 were required. The mathematics didn't balance, the equation failed, and far below. Something shrieked in triumph as chains that had held for millennia began to crack. Thaddeus dropped back into the noose and let it take him. The rope snapped taut, his body swayed into position, 7th in the line, completing the descending sequence, and from his crushed throat, a sound emerged, not words, not even human, but the final note in the chord, the last voice in the harmony. The song was whole again, the barrier held, the deep subsided back into its prison, its moment of near freedom denied. As consciousness faded, Thaddeus understood. The gate's power came from acceptance, from willing sacrifice. Those 5 seconds of refusal had nearly doomed everything. His choice to return, to embrace the noose, to complete the pattern, that willing submission generated the spiritual energy needed to reinforce the prison. Force alone was insufficient. The souls had to choose their fate. He became one with the chorus then, his voice joining 6,000 others in eternal song. His body hung on the Whitmore veranda, swaying in windless air, his face turned toward the gate in perpetual greeting. And he would hang there across decades and centuries, his preserved corpse maintained by the gate's power, until the property was sold again, until a new family arrived, until the cycle repeated and 7 more were chosen to take his place. The gate was patient, the gate was hungry, and the gate was merciful in its own terrible way, because what it imprisoned was so much worse than death could ever be. When dawn broke over Ashford Hollow on the 28th day, a delegation from town approached the Whitmore estate with ropes and shovels. They found 11 figures hanging from the veranda, the 4 who'd died before, and the 7 new offerings, all arranged in perfect mathematical precision, all facing the gate in eternal welcome. The town council voted to burn the bodies and leave the property abandoned once more. 20 years seemed like a long time. Surely by then, they'd find a better solution. Surely by then, someone would discover how to break the curse. But as they rode away, leaving the gate standing silent and satisfied on Gallows Hill, they all knew the truth. In 1873, it would happen again. 7 more would be chosen. 7 more would hang. The cycle would continue as it had for 3,000 years, and would continue until the stars went cold or humanity found the courage to face what the gate had been built to contain. The Whitmore Veranda stood empty now, save for the wind that sometimes stirred the abandoned ropes. But if you visited at midnight during a full moon, if you stood very still and listened very carefully, you could hear them 6,000 voices raised in harmony, singing the song that held back the end of the world, and carved fresh on the iron archway. Already beginning to smoke with anticipation were 7 new names. The names of those who would discover the bodies in 1873, the names of those who would investigate and witness and become marked. The names of the next offering. The gate was patient, the gate was hungry. And the gate was never satisfied for long. And there you have it, the complete horror of the Whitmore Veranda hangings and the terrible truth behind the gate, a cycle of sacrifice stretching back 3,000 years. 7 souls every 20 years, all to prevent something far worse from breaking free. Did Thaddeus make the right choice in those final moments? Could anything have broken the curse, or is this the price humanity must pay for survival? Thank you so much for watching this dark tale unfold. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future horror stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Would you have made the same choice as Thaddeus? Do you think the gate is truly protecting us? Or is there another way? And if you want even more nightmare fuel, check out the playlist linked in the description for more macabre tales from America's dark history. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.